somehow he came out with a belief in kindness and forgiveness and dignity. And I think my relationship with my grandpa was formed around that. You look at like the horrors and the atrocities from the Holocaust, and it would be perplexing to imagine, how does someone just find forgiveness, or find a way to live in the world without just, hate. But his motto in life was that hate begets hate, and it really gets you nowhere.
Welcome to Door, a multi-generational story of memory, trauma, and identity. I'm Miriam Terlinchamp. In this 5-episode series, we follow how my family, over 4 generations, metabolized a history of survival, trauma, and hope, and reclaimed a story nearly erased. This is episode 3. He sang so loudly. The sound is so foreign, I can't tell what it is at first, but someone or something is in terrible pain. I throw off my covers, bound out of bed, flick on the lights, and run towards the sound. Years later, I'll know this feeling as a mother, hearing my baby wail from the other room, wondering, praying, hoping that she's okay. But tonight, I'm 25 years old in a loft apartment in Berlin, 5,000 miles from home, and it's not a baby crying. It's my 89-year-old grandfather, Simon, screaming. He's sitting in the kitchen in a rumpled white undershirt and boxers, blood dripping from his shins. His hands are on his knees, palms up, as his whole body shakes with tears that are coming from a place much deeper than his paper-thin skin. Not knowing where to start, his hands or the blood, I choose instead to hold his face, thumbs brushing his tears. "What is it?" I ask. "What did you do?" He sobs. Blood pools in his drooping socks. It's okay that he can't answer. The questions are really for me. What did I expect, bringing him here after all these years? Growing up in Wachenbuchen, a small town outside Frankfurt, Germany, Simon Strauss always dreamed of going to Berlin, the big city. When he was old enough, the Nuremberg laws were already in place, and being Jewish, that landed him in a different sort of travel, to a concentration camp rather than a tourist visit. 70 years later, to the month, I thought maybe enough time had passed, and we, grandfather and granddaughter, could take that once-in-a-lifetime trip he had dreamed about so long ago. And yet here we are, one night in, bleeding in a kitchen in the middle of the night. We should never have come here. I was wrong, I tell him. I busy myself cleaning his wound and the table leg he torn it against, telling him the plan. From now on, we will spend our trip taking boat rides, seeing art, and eating ice cream. Nothing sad, no museums, no cemeteries, just the fun stuff. This time, he's the one who reaches for my face, turning my chin so I can see him. As our eyes meet, he speaks to me in his assured, sweet, wise voice. "Miriam, that's not how this works," he says. "No matter what we do, the nightmares will come anyway." Here's my mother, Nadine.
My father, in those last few years of his life, had horrible memories and acted them out in ways that were typical of Holocaust survivors. He was in a care center, in that he'd wake up in the middle of the night and start marching and trying to put helmets on and all kinds of things like that, because his world was so shaken. And in some ways, I think, have I become that person, just a little less dementia maybe, but that I have those nightmares of my father's as I see so much of what I took for granted erode.
This is my cousin, Mark.
The summer of 96, I was working there. I was taking law school in Houston. I'm living at my grandparents this summer. And in the middle of the night, more than once, I would hear him scream in the middle of the night. And I never say anything about it. I mean, that just made me realize this is with him every day. And it's not that I didn't think it was, but when you hear somebody have these night terrors, it may have strike you.
Many survivor families, and Jews in general, have an aversion to Germany and German things. There are items and brands many Jews will not buy because of complicity or gains made from the suffering of Jews during the Holocaust. Many Jewish people struggle to hear the German language or to visit Germany due to its centrality in our people's suffering.
I guess I shouldn't use bad language here, but there was something that you kind of wanted to. I don't like going to Germany. I haven't been back since, besides an airport. I feel very uncomfortable there. It's just the way I am, but there's something inside of me that kind of wanted to knock on the door and like, hey, we made it. I just see old people there and I wonder what they were doing in the 30s and 40s. The only thing I would look forward to going back to Germany would be to take my kids and my wife to the house.
This Jewish cultural habit of avoiding Germany and German objects is pervasive all over the world, except for in Israel, where the buses and the taxis are Mercedes-Benz, a deal struck with the Israeli government as part of reparations for using Jewish forced labor in a concentration camp at its company plant in Frankfurt. And there's a growing number of young Israelis who are seeking German citizenship as part of the reclamation of what was taken from their great-grandparents. But this aversion and painful association with Germany and German products, though very common for many Jewish people, is not true in my family. This is my sister, Julia.
We were never that Jewish family that was like, never buy anything German. Like, he loved going back to Germany. He was so proud of his German heritage. That is unprecedented in many ways, and I didn't realize that. So I think that's the part that I only learned much later in life, was how incredibly positive and open-minded my grandfather was about the complexities of what is the Holocaust and what does it mean to be Jewish in a way that I think many Jewish families have never been able to heal in the same way.
Despite being a concentration camp survivor and the majority of his family rounded up and murdered in Nazi Germany, Simon did not feel adversarial towards Germany. He was able to separate individual actors from the nation itself. In fact, he often recounted his own father's nationalism with pride.
We just consider ourselves as Germans. My father served in World War I. All my family, many of my uncles served in World War I, and some of them were hurt in the World War I. My family, my aunts, my uncles, dozens, hundreds. These were people who lived there. These people who lived there for centuries. These were people who were in the First World War. My father was in the First World War. I had an uncle who was in the First World War, lost an eye. I'm a German, I'm not going. This is my army paper, discharge paper of United States Army. I was discharged 14 November 45, and I was inducted August 25th, 41. Got a few medals, but everybody else got medals in the army. After coming out of the concentration camp, of course, you had to have a passport to go. This is my German passport. Of course, when you were in the concentration camp, they cut your hair off. Also, you got an additional name in order to be sure you didn't get mixed up with Germans. My name is Simon, and they gave me another name, Israel.
Simon's younger brother, Lou, felt quite differently about Germany. This is Herr Herbert Biegemann, who leads the effort of organizing the Stoppelstein in Frankfurt and was a longtime pen pal of Simon's.
Simon's brother was always a little bit skeptical about Germany and being here. All these events and those attempts to meet and talk about the past, Lou would often ask if this is just all for show, and why are you doing this? Simon was more of a pedagogue in this and really looked at it from a teaching point of view, very much, and thought that if he talks about it and can pass his story on to the next generation, people will learn. Simon believed that there's something good coming out of this contact and the connection with other Germans, whereas his brother was skeptical about it for good reasons.
But Simon held on to some of the dreams he had as a child about his home country, even though by the time that he came of age, his rights as a German citizen were compromised because of his Jewish identity. In fact, after the war, after gaining American citizenship, after starting a family, Simon returned to Germany 4 times. The first time, in 1947, he went as an American soldier. After finding refuge in the United States, Simon almost immediately enlisted in the military. 4 months after being in the States, he was sent back to Germany.
Being an American soldier in Germany and living in that neighborhood, being stationed there, I had an opportunity to visit, after the war, various places. My grandmother, my grandfather, both sides of my family buried in that neighborhood. When I first wanted to find the grave of my grandmother and grandfather, I was an American soldier, and I went to the American civilian government, the one which run the Germans at that particular time. And they were very cooperative. I introduced myself. I come from that neighborhood. I said, do you have anything? I was looking for survivor. I'm looking for roots. When I went to the house where my mother lived last, it was destroyed. Frankfurt was completely destroyed. Hanau was completely destroyed. The school I went to was completely destroyed.
The photos that hung on Simon's walls all those years afterwards, and that now hang on each of his children and grandchildren's walls, are from that first return trip to Germany. One day, during his tour, he was able to break into a records office where he found photos of his family members being deported to the camps. It was evidence enough for what he needed to know about their fate, and those hanging threads of hope that someone might have survived were destroyed. The second time, 1977, he was invited to return as a survivor. As part of an ongoing effort of reconciliation by the German government that began in the late 1960s, Simon and his brothers were invited to return to their birthplace and what was once their family home. They went to the cemetery, they saw the town, and they knocked on the door of their home. There was no answer. 30 years after fleeing that space, and still they could not enter. Instead, their neighbor, Heinrich Müller, who had been a childhood friend of the Strauss boys, greeted them. They had coffee, shared stories, and there were plenty of tears. For every pilgrimage that followed, by Simon's children and then by his grandchildren, it was Heinrich who would meet us. The linguistic barrier was high, as none of us spoke German and he did not speak English. But the connection between our survival and the tragedy that happened in his town of Wachenbuchen was lost on no one. The third time, in 1987, he chose to return as an American citizen on his own accord. This time, the trip was easier. There was greater acceptance and understanding about the Holocaust at this point. While education about the Holocaust had been part of German education since the late 1960s, there was a notable shift in the 1980s. There was increased inclusion in school curricula, memorials were being erected, and there was an effort to connect historical facts with the spread of anti-Semitism and new understandings on how to combat xenophobia. This time, a small group from the town met Simon, his wife Sylvia, and his brother Lou. They hosted a luncheon, took them on tours, and built connections with one another that would continue for the rest of their lives. The last time was in 2002 with me. This trip was not about the Holocaust. This was about fulfilling a lifelong wish to see a part of the world Simon always dreamed about. And now he had the means, the health, and the support to make it happen. The plan was to enjoy the trip and Berlin as an exciting and beautiful place, independent from its hateful history. But that's not how life or the world works. Context is everything. In the moment we set foot in the country, the presence of Simon's lived experience was visceral. Simon's memories, his stories, which previously had only been heard within public settings, when he was lecturing as a docent at the Holocaust Museum, or in deeply private moments, heard only in stolen snippets of time, like in car rides or waiting in line, now were flowing freely from him.
My brother, at 14 and a half, went with youth leader to Israel. He was only 14 and a half. He was a very capable diamond cutter, and he was an apprentice with a diamond merchant, very capable, but the Nazis forced him to dismiss him. He was doing very well, a young boy. My father had died in 1928. I was active in the Zionist movement in 1936 and 37, and after initial apprenticeship in Berlin, he came home. He had to leave Germany within 3 days, not because he was forced, but the ship left. So at 14 and a half, which is a very young age, he went through Marseille, eventually illegally to Israel. He told me that the first experience they had, when they entered the coast of Israel, which was Palestine then, and they gave him guns. And that was not the most glorious experience of his life, but he made it very successful. He was in kibbutz. He became eventually chief mechanic of a Moshav Oftim, which is a cooperative settlement. And he eventually applied for flying school, and he went to flying school with Ezra Weitman and Rabin, and he graduated the first time, and he was a flyer in the War of Independence. In retrospect, while life was tough, he wouldn't be alive today. Today he has two wonderful sons.
Back to my mother, Nadine.
We all grew up with the stories that the Germans, the locals, would just move into houses if they thought they were better than their own. I didn't know until more recently that some people in that particular year that my father's mother sold the house so that he could have money to get out of Germany. And I think I grew up with the belief my father could name the different neighbors he didn't think were compliant. He did tell a story about one whose son was in a POW camp. And when my father came back from the concentration camp where they were not yet killing Jews, if you could get a ticket to get out, they asked my father if he could go to the Gestapo and see if they could get his son out. And he always remembers that. And that was in my image, like, really? That took some desperation. And the other thing in my mind was my father tells of another neighbor, how they were kind of just nobody, but they became Nazis and they were therefore given boots. This was a poor village, but they got shiny boots. And many stories throughout many years was about this neighbor who had shiny boots, and it made him feel very important. And he was very abusive to the locals, and because he felt he was important. And I think that remained a metaphor in my life, that if you put a uniform on somebody, it can work very positively because you're infused with that kind of influence, and very negatively if they happen to be Nazis. And that was always in my mind as well. Still is.
Some of the stories I had heard before, but the one shared by Simon in Germany held a different tenor. The stories were not carefully told repetitions. These stories were alive and well, undiminished with the passing of time. I was prepared to talk to Simon about his experience and about his nightmares in the way he had taught us to approach him, tenderly, without follow-up questions, accepting bits and pieces as though the stories were being shared in whole cloth. But this blast of energy, exploding stories in tears, that I wasn't ready for. And why now? He'd been to Germany before, to his home no less. He had lunched with his neighbors, visited his father's grave, walked along the train tracks that stole him away to the camp. Why didn't it happen there? But you don't ask someone that. The only thing you can do is what we did. Walks, boat rides, ice cream, and allow the stories to unfold the way that he needed them to. On one such walk, with one such ice cream, we found a bench overlooking what we thought was an artful construction site. We sat and people watched as they navigated the structure. Then, on closer inspection, We saw that there were pillars of different sized concrete blocks, part maze, part cemetery. It was a memorial for the murdered Jews of Europe who perished in the Holocaust. Children ran through the space. Adults wandered, lingering to read small notes or take a closer look at the embedded artifacts in the stones. We remained on the bench. He pointed to one of the tourists.
Papa said, "Do you think he's Jewish?"
This wasn't a unique situation. It was a hobby for my grandfather. He'd happily talk to anyone and then ask them,
"So, are you Jewish?"
It was a compliment to him.
We used to go to a part of town that you could walk in, and it was comfortable for him to walk in, and it's on the Lake Washington, so it's beautiful. It's Madison Park, and it was little cafes, and he loved to get his pedicure done and his manicure done, and we used to go there, and there was a Trader Joe's there. And because it's a diverse part of town, many of the people would wear colorful African hats, and inevitably he would say to one of them, "So, are you Jewish?" Of course, they were from Africa or someplace. They say no, and he says, "You don't have to hide it. You should be proud to be Jewish." And he would do this over and over again, so much so that I hesitated to go to Trader Joe's, but then he began to do it at cafes as well, where people were clearly diverse and they looked diverse. And he couldn't see that. He truly couldn't. There was one cafe in particular, they got a kick out of him, so it was a safe place for me. He would question their business practices and how do you run this cafe? And one time or two times they would bring out the partner and they were of different races. And my father said, "So, you're brothers, right?" He literally couldn't see the color differences. And they could have been brothers, they weren't. But in those last few years of his life, he just saw everyone as beautiful and potentially Jewish.
So on this trip, sitting on the bench watching the tourists weave themselves through the Holocaust memorial, and he asked,
"Are they Jewish?"
It didn't feel unusual, so I answered the way I normally would. "I don't think so, Grandpa. I think those are tourists from other countries and Berlin residents who have come to learn and pay respects." He starts to cry. And before I can move to comfort him, he says something that he probably had said before, but in this context held a very new weight.
Have you made peace with the German people in your own mind?
Pardon me?
Have you made peace with the German people in your
In the
mind?
beginning, I couldn't think about it, but I don't hate. I don't hate. To be very frank, I know people who hate, never forgive and something like that. I know my own personally, when I went through hell, I also found a lot of good people.
Anyone who knew Simon knew him as a man who held onto positivity, even while suffering. Nadine.
He chose to believe because he needed to believe there was some greater machination out there. I don't have experience with my father being transactional in the sense that this happened and therefore there's a God. He had a much, I think, more sophisticated view of the fact that he chose to believe, and he used those words, "I chose to believe that there was some kind of rhyme and rhythm to the world." Well, he was often questioned about it because he had a fervent belief in a God. He liked prayer, but he wasn't particularly wedded to a particular prayer. Of course, he was Jewish, and that's what his comfort and familiarity was. But generally, the act of prayer, which for him sometimes was sitting in a synagogue and going to sleep, or chiming into a prayer in the middle of it, a tune, was a way to be present with his perished family, I think, and also a connectivity there, because he wasn't, again, wedded to particular liturgy, but it was familiar to him and therefore comforting. But he was often asked, "How did you maintain this connection to your Judaism and to God and everything that you went through?" And he said, "Because I chose to." He used those words in letters and when you talk with him. "I have to believe there is something greater than us here."
This is my cousin, Marika.
He was really an example of what resilience and grace and really moral clarity looked like. I think that's a big part of it because he, on paper, had every reason to be bitter, but he really, most of the time, chose love and decency. It's not about forgetting, but it's about like being able to recognize that we have a choice and how we build from here. And that I think if I could hope for one thing about the way my grandpa's story influences anyone that hears it, is that people realize that the values we pass down matter. And because I'm standing on the shoulders of someone who chose love, in a world that gave him every reason not to. Like his story is one that you're like, how? What? You chose love? Like, that's amazing. Like, that's the kind of legacy that I think can change lives. And all the songs and all of the cultural artifacts around us that speak to this concept that seems so broad and almost unbelievable, I actually think is what is going to change lives. And it's definitely what changed mine.
To choose, to actively forgive, to find beauty in strangers paying homage to what you lost, to embrace the learning journey of others even at the expense of your own pain and having to tell and retell it. Well, that's a whole other capacity to do so within the context of the very place where the trauma occurred. I watched him watch the visitors. It felt like observing a miracle. To see the bindings of his trauma fall away and in their place, sparks of hope that through education and memorial, perhaps it truly might never again happen. Nadine, again.
Every people that has been a victim deserves to be heard and remembered so that we can make some steps to touching upon our better angels, for want of a better word. And I think going back to the site of this horror reminded me of the power of that in much the same way other memorials do. And I was always very skeptical of memorials and statues and maintaining the Auschwitz as a museum. And is there going to be a time where we can not have these things? I don't think so anymore. I think our memory is too short, and that we do need to continue to build these memorials, both to the victims of man's worst inclinations, but also to the heroes among us. And again, I used to be skeptical of the money that used to go into these things, but now I think we have to be reminded and remember them in context, because yesterday's freedom fighters, today's terrorists. So we have to also teach ourselves and to our next generation of the context in which people were thought of as freedom fighters or terrorists or heroes or revisionists.
Here's Dr. Sarah Crane.
I am the visiting assistant professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies in the Department of Judaic Studies at the University of Cincinnati, and also the scholar in residence at the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanities Center. When I teach my course on Holocaust memorials, I always kind of start with this idea, with this claim, that the easiest way to forget about something is to memorialize it. Because then you can claim that the work has been done. You've asked the questions, you've done the work in whatever that particular moment was, you built the monument or the memorial. We talk in my class as well about how we typically associate monuments with some sort of triumphant narrative, whereas memorials are supposed to invite us to mourn and reflect, right? And there is sometimes a tension where certain memorials or monuments can be seen to be doing both. But we look at the history of Holocaust memorials in America. We look at also examples in Germany, Poland, and Israel. And one thing that we see is that there was a point around the 90s where it was decided that Holocaust memorials could no longer just tell the story of the Holocaust as a historical event or of who was lost, it needed to emphasize that this was a question that we needed to keep asking. We see, for example, the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe in Berlin. Throughout the 90s into the early 2000s, there were a lot of debates around what would a Holocaust memorial in Berlin look like. And the answer is that it needed to emphasize that the Holocaust was not over and that the questions that we bring to the Holocaust were not over. It's honestly a remarkable memorial in the sense of every time you visit it, it's different. It's basically a configuration of hundreds of concrete blocks of differing sizes, some of which are tall enough that when you walk between them, you feel like you completely disappear. So depending on what part of the memorial you walk in, you have a different experience. It's deeply disorienting. And you kind of ask yourself, like, is this really a way for us to mourn and remember the dead? And the kind of question is, yes, it is, if it convinces you that our project of doing that is never finished, that you can't just visit a cemetery and feel like you've done the work of mourning those who were lost in the Holocaust, that there is a relevance that we're going to have to keep debating and thinking about as part of remembrance. And we see this in many different memorials around the world more recently. So my students, I think, really connect with this idea that memorials have a duty to give us a space that we wouldn't have in our lives otherwise.
The memorial in Berlin was so large, so public, with so many people walking through it. Simon didn't have to hold the whole burden of his story anymore. There were others finding ways to say, never forget, never again. In hindsight, this was the moment in my mind when he went from an aging man to an old man. It wasn't the hearing aids or the walking stick or the million bathroom breaks that made him old. It was the release of the story and the belief that in a single lifetime, very important elements about human society could change. That night, there were no nightmares. On Shabbat, the Sabbath, we decided to go to the new synagogue on Oranienburgstrasse for Friday evening worship. The synagogue sits in the heart of downtown Berlin, whose large facade and golden dome communicates to passerbys that there was, at one point in time, a large, thriving Jewish community that occupied this space. When we arrived, we presented our passports to the armed security personnel at the door. We wove our way through the main level, which is now a museum, by intentionally preserving the destruction that rained down upon its halls. Glass and steel traced the perimeter of the massive sanctuary that held 3,200 seats and is now rubble. 20 years later, only upon research for this project do I learn that this is not the first time someone in my family has been in this space. This is Lou's son, Ralph.
And then there was the Orthodox synagogue, which was rebuilt in Germany. I'm blocking on the name. But it was really a beautiful synagogue, a beautiful venue. It was really kind of nice because my father had trained at the Orangeburg synagogue before he went to Palestine. They gave him Hebrew lessons and told him a little bit about what farming life was going to be like and stuff like that. So I know he spent about 6 months there.
This is Ralph's wife, Mindy.
In the administrative building, the actual sanctuary, which was humongous, was destroyed during the Holocaust. And afterwards, the East Germans tried to blow it up. But they could not take down the administrative offices. So where we davened in that building was where Lou had studied. I think Ralph and I both were disappointed that we weren't in this main sanctuary because we didn't realize it was totally destroyed. But when we realized that we were in the building that Lou had walked in and studied in, it meant all the more so. What happened was he had to go to Berlin because he had to be prepared. This 14-year-old kid who'd never been out of Wachenbuch, and I don't know if he had ever been in Berlin before.
That's the thing with sacred family stories. Even long after the person has passed, the story continues to unfold, offering us, second, third, and fourth generations a chance to add new meanings and connections to the story that is bigger than any single one of us. But on that Friday night, it was just me and my grandfather walking into a small chapel on the upper floor of the synagogue. There was no need to say who we were or why we were there. An 89-year-old Jewish man holding the hand of his granddaughter. It was clear. We were on a pilgrimage, one that perhaps we didn't know we were on when we first embarked, but now, a week later, we understood this trip wasn't a vacation or a chance to see a beautiful European city. This was something different. We sat down in the middle of the sanctuary, much like we had all my life. Softly, we worked through the prayers, chanting under our breath, calm in the structure and familiarity of the liturgy. And then it came to my grandfather's favorite prayer, V'shamru.
V'shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat.
The words are from the biblical book of Exodus, about the law of passing the commandment to observe and guard the Sabbath from generation to generation. He never sang it like a prayer. He sang it like a bar song, 3 drinks in. V'shamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat la'asot et ha-Shabbat ledorotam berit olam. He sang it so loudly, I could hear stifled giggles, and also, the congregation met his energy, singing full voice, yes, the Sabbath is our inheritance in every generation. And as the prayer came to a close, my grandfather sang on, V'shamru. Maybe it was his hearing aids, or he didn't realize it was over. And so good-naturedly, the community joined him in a second round. And when that round was over, yet again he sang, V'shamru. And this time we knew it was no accident. It was not his age or his abilities. He was praying as loudly as he could in a golden, destroyed, and remade house of worship, singing with his granddaughter, this woman who by all accounts should not be in this world, because it was one thing for him to survive, but to also get to have a life, to build a family, and for that family to sit with him and sing joyfully, humbly, in protest and in praise from generation to generation. Well, that was nothing short of a miracle. Ohio Humanities made this episode of Door to Door possible. Door to Door is a production of the Institute for the Next Jewish Future and part of the family of podcasts of Judaism Unbound. Created by Miriam Terlinchamp, directed by Joey Taylor, produced at Monastery Studios, original music by Rich Hordinsky, and art by Katie Kasner. Check the show notes for bonus material and resources. We'd love to hear from you. So you can email us at miriam@judaismunbound.com or find us at www.judaismunbound.com/door-to-door. Stay tuned for our next episode, where after 87 years, a memorial is finally erected on the steps of our family home. Thanks for listening.